Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 16th, 2022, and before we get into this video, I want to say that I am officially moved out of my first year in college. I'm back home, and I'm back in my traditional recording setting, which means now you are going to see, and I know I've said this on multiple occasions, but I promise you this time, a much more routine upload schedule, and a lot more output of certain things that I've sort of dialed back while I was at college, such as election night videos or live streams, things that I think are integral in my channel and have been a foundational part of it for quite some time that I really want to bring back, especially as we go into our midterm elections. And being home absolutely allows me to do that. Now, in today's video, we are going to be talking about the state of Pennsylvania, more specifically, the Republican primary in the gubernatorial election. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Ethan, why are you talking about this in specific? What is so interesting about this that it deserves its own video? And while I talk about primaries in many other cases, I typically do so after the election actually occurs. Well, here's the interesting thing about the Pennsylvania governor's race this time around. It ultimately comes down to the frontrunner and how this frontrunner might end up forcing the race itself to move towards a leftward direction. Allow me to explain. Doug Mastriano is the current leader in the Republican primary for governor in the state of Pennsylvania. He didn't start out in the lead. In fact, Lou Barletta started out with about 21% of the vote. His amount now is about 20%, meaning there is seemingly a significant reduction. Doug Mastriano, on the other hand, went from 17 points at the beginning of this primary now to 33 points, practically doubling where he was back in the old map, or on the old numbers. And the reason why that is significant is because there has been a significant building of momentum on Doug Mastriano's side that has allowed him to move up in the Republican primary. Lou Barletta might ring a bell if you've been watching my channel for quite some time, because in 2018, I covered the Pennsylvania Senate race that occurred coinciding with the Democratic wave that was this midterm election. And Bob Casey, as the incumbent, won against Lou Barletta, not by 1 point, not by half a point, but by an astonishing 13.1 percentage points across the entire state. Bob Casey decimated him in this Senate race, and it wasn't even close. Fast forward to 2022, we are now in a competitive Senate and governor's race that we're looking at, except now Lou Barletta, instead of running for the Senate, is running for governor. But he was presumably the nominee for quite some time. I mean, people looked at this and said he is the only real one with statewide name recognition amongst the Republican Party. But then Doug Mastriano started to build a lead. But then came in a huge concern about electability, a huge concern about whether or not he should be the nominee. And as that momentum built, it led up to an endorsement from President Trump just a few days ago. In fact, 2 days ago is when Donald Trump endorsed Doug Mastriano for Pennsylvania governor. It is quite interesting to see exactly how much this race has really moved in favor of a candidate that is ultimately going to prove himself to be potentially a weak eventual nominee. We'll talk about what actually happens here and what data is telling us that he can be a weak eventual nominee. But my point is that this governor candidate could very well be a very bad governor candidate for the Pennsylvania Republicans. And we'll look at a bunch of data that tells us exactly this. Now, the reason why he's weak is talked about in the very early lines of this article. It says Pennsylvania State Senator Doug Mastriano on Saturday landed the coveted endorsement of former President Donald Trump with days to go. This primary is occurring tomorrow. I probably should have said that in the beginning of the video. And this endorsement here is quite interesting. Doug Mastriano was at the Capitol during the January 6th insurrection. This has led people to consider to even move him out of the Pennsylvania primary. And I'm not kidding about that. There were plenty of plans in place, at least in other states, where eventual nominees, or at least those who seem like they could be leading in the nomination process, are sort of vulnerable to the GOP coming in last minute and saying, no, we don't want you here anymore, because they know that potentially this candidate could be a bad candidate for their ticket. If you want a specific example, we would have to go back to the 2021 Virginia governor's race, and we'll talk about that for a very good reason. Because if we head over to the governor election that occurred in 2021, you will find some very, very interesting elections. You will find that Glenn Youngkin won the general election by about 2 points by maintaining this persona that he was not associated with President Trump, but represented traditional conservative values while capturing the Trump base. If you want to see what happened, actually, Glenn Youngkin did not win this primary in truly the fairest sense. I don't say this to be at all any type of, caster of doubt on the legitimacy of this election, more so on how it was actually executed. If you take a look at the polling numbers within a primary, there was one candidate that the Republican Party did not want to win, and that was State Senator Amanda Chase. She started out in this position polling high. The reason being, she labeled herself and brandished herself as Virginia's Donald Trump. She came out there and said, "We are going to make Virginia great again." But the Republicans in Virginia were smart about this. They saw her as their biggest threat to the general election, not Terry McAuliffe. So when she was starting out with a large lead across a field that was split up and down the ballot, they opted to move from a traditional primary, which is normally used in states like Virginia, because Chase was leading in the polls by the last time that primary polls were taken, and moved into a convention to a point where it was much more focused around traditional Republicans, much more focused around establishment Republicans. And if you take a look at it, the numbers in the primary poll were very, very different than the convention poll. And in order to participate in said convention, it was more working around than voting in a primary. The point is, Amanda Chase led in every single poll. If you take a look at the first poll from February 2021, Amanda Chase was at 24%, Glenn Youngkin was at 5%. You fast forward later down that month, Amanda Chase at 17%, Glenn Youngkin at 3%. He started to build momentum, but it wasn't clear that Glenn Youngkin was going to win the primary. He very well could have, but the Republicans decided to go through a much safer avenue. And instead of Amanda Chase being the biggest threat to Glenn Youngkin, she ended up losing in the fifth round of the ranked choice voting situation. Also, maybe a testament to using ranked choice voting because the Republican Party utilizes it in their GOP convention, but of course, discussion for a whole nother video. Glenn Youngkin ended up winning. Why? Because he was the stronger candidate, I would say, in the truest sense, and he won the general election. What happened here now with Doug Mastriano is that the Pennsylvania Republicans realized they made a mistake. If you take a look at some of these numbers, people are saying, close to the campaign, that everyone is coming to the realization that we should have come to this 2 months ago. This being a plot to remove Doug Mastriano from being the frontrunner in the Pennsylvania governor's race, because they know he is a weak candidate. And I've been telling you he's been a weak candidate. We know he was at the January 6th insurrection. We know that he has been baselessly alleging that the Pennsylvania presidential election was stolen for the Democratic Party. And these things worry the Republican Party in the state of Pennsylvania. But clearly, that messaging is working. But how effective is it? Not so much when you get to a general election. Here we have a poll from, I think it's pronounced Osage Research. The point is that this is a Republican poll. This is an internal poll that probably was not meant to be released in such a large fashion. I think when this poll was released, people weren't really expecting it to gain that much traction. It's just an internal poll when there are plenty of others you can take a look at for the Pennsylvania primary or some general election numbers. And what they find is that the state of Pennsylvania is very much a swing state, but not in the sense that you might think. The general election in the generic ballot shows that Republicans, at least, are doing well. It shows that if there was a nameless Republican for governor, that they would win by 3 points over a nameless Democrat. That's what we mean with generic Democrat and generic Republican. It shows that it is a historic high for Republicans to have any generic ballot lead in this group because you're talking about swing voters. 42% of Democrats, 35% Republicans, and 20% independents. Sort of like the composition of the state of Pennsylvania. But then it gets a lot more difficult for the Republican Party. Because it says here, it's clear if the GOP nominates a strong candidate, they would start as the frontrunner. Well, guess what? They don't have a strong candidate. Here's what we find. Looking at the initial numbers, a test between Doug Mastriano and Josh Shapiro, the incumbent attorney general, the numbers go from a 3-point Republican lead amongst this group to a 8-point lead for the Democratic potential nominee, Josh Shapiro. I'm going to refer to him as the presumptive nominee. He's been endorsed by the Pennsylvania Democratic Party. They know he's a strong candidate, and these numbers show it. Envision this for just a moment. If they were to nominate any other Republican, they would start out with a 3-point lead. If they nominate Doug Mastriano, who is leading in the polls by double digits now, they would lose by 8. It is an 11-point swing. And Mastriano's name being mentioned or invoked at all has already swung 23% of swing Republicans to vote for Josh Shapiro. Swing Republicans are a group that Republicans have lost. In 2016, they lost them to Josh Shapiro. In 2018, they lost them to Bob Casey. In 2022, they might lose them again to Josh Shapiro. They lost them in 2020 to Josh Shapiro as well. Pennsylvania has very strong Democrats. You look at the governor's race. In 2018, Tom Wolf won by double digits. You look at the Senate race, won by double digits. Why does this happen? It might have been a red wave, but in 2014, a blue wave, but in 2014, it was a red wave, and the Democratic nominee, Tom Wolf, won by, get this, 10 percentage points across the state. The point is that the Republican frontrunner, and I say that so many times, but at the end of the day, the Republican frontrunner in the state of Pennsylvania for the primary here is doing well in the primary, but horrible in the general election. And the Republican Party of Pennsylvania very much seems to be building their own grave. These are swing voters. These are voters that are willing to back a generic Republican over a generic Democrat. But when they directly mention the name for Doug Mastriano, it's a loss by 8 points. Not to mention the fact that Josh Shapiro is an individually strong candidate for the Democratic Party. Not only does the Republican Party have a weak nominee, but the Democrats have the best of the best, practically speaking. You take a look at Joe Biden's victory in Pennsylvania, it's impressive. He flipped the state with 20 electoral votes from Donald Trump. He won by 1.2. They invested, both parties, hundreds of millions of dollars into the state over the past 4 years, and the Democrats ended up on top. But Joe Biden's victory was nothing similar to Josh Shapiro's victory in the Attorney General's race. When you take a little bit closer down and take a closer look, Josh Shapiro won by 5 percentage points. Guess what actually happens now that Josh Shapiro has won by 5 percentage points? He has the title and the name as the Democrat who has won the most votes ever in a statewide race. He has won the most votes out of any candidate in a general election as a Democrat. He outperformed Biden, he outperformed Clinton, outperformed Obama, not necessarily Obama by margin, but by overall raw vote share. And if you take a look back, Josh Shapiro actually wasn't elected in 2020 for the first time, but elected back in 2016, a race that coincided with the presidential election. Well, look what happened. Josh Shapiro won by about 3 points across the state, in a state that pushed away from Hillary Clinton, pushed away from the Democratic Party for the first time in 24 years. 2 decades had passed, and the one Democrat that was able to win, in fact, flip the race from red to blue, was Josh Shapiro. Meaning that you are now in a position where he has done well in the state twice, outperformed national Democrats twice, and you have a Republican who is underperforming national Republicans by 11 percentage points. Now you see why the GOP tried to have a plot to stop Doug Mastriano. Truly speaking, they should have done it 2 months ago. The same way the Republicans did in Virginia with Amanda Chase, but I don't think they really thought, at least, that Doug Mastriano was going to be a realistic nominee. You take a look at Lou Barletta, he already was nominated statewide. You take a look at the candidate race from 2018, Lou Barletta got 63% of the vote statewide in the Republican primary. Nobody thought that he was going to be that nominee, at least Doug Mastriano being he. But then came in everything. And the one solidifying factor of it all is the Donald Trump endorsement. Because if he could reach this point without the Trump endorsement, it is worrying to the Republican Party about any prospect of stopping him, especially since the election is going to be tomorrow. One extraneous factor that is not so extraneous when you actually think about it is the Pennsylvania Senate race. I know we've been talking about it quite often, but the Republican primary there is actually in a similar predicament. The United States Senate race in the state of Pennsylvania could go in the Republican primary to Kathy Barnett. She is a political commentator. She also disputed the election results and believed that her race in 2020 was rigged. Guess how much she lost by? She accused the Democrats of stealing this race from her when she lost by 19 points. It's laughable, to say the least. But she's doing well. She is now surging in the numbers across the state. You take a look at where she was very early on, and Kathy Barnett started off in the low single digits. But then she has started to rise and rise and rise, even with Donald Trump endorsing Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz could very well come in third based off of the momentum of the state. You take a look, Kathy Barnett went from being in Real Clear Politics at 6.7 now to second place, beating even David McCormick, who started out with a large lead over Dr. Oz, or at least large enough to a point where now he's losing. The Trump endorsement clearly has benefited Dr. Oz, but it really is anybody's game. The average here is spread out by 2 to 3 points, meaning it can fluctuate depending on the margin of error or the impact of last-minute endorsements. This primary is tomorrow, though, and if the Republican Party does truly nominate the two people who look like they are on the pathway to victory, potentially Kathy Barnett and especially Doug Mastriano, they could be in for 2 losses to the Democratic Party in races that were absolutely otherwise winnable, because the numbers don't lie. They show that a strong GOP candidate, or really a nameless one, would perform 11 points better than Doug Mastriano. This is where the GOP has been really messing up. And at the end of the day, it's something that is only going to be of their own making. We will see what happens in Pennsylvania in the general election. I have no doubt that it will get closer than obviously an 8-point victory for Josh Shapiro, but I think these are some very early warning signs, and the GOP definitely could have prevented themselves from being in this position had they taken an avenue that was explored by the Virginia Republican Party back in 2021. But then again, questions of legitimacy and questions of the validity of changing a primary last minute to avoid a nominee winning might be raised more nationally, because Pennsylvania is a lot more close of a state than Virginia was, at least in swing state status, and there definitely would be a lot of consideration about a group that already believes that Democratic elections are rigged and unfair. I can only imagine what they would say about a process in which Republicans completely took away the idea of a primary and opted to use a more traditional, more technically speaking, unfair convention process. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video there where I've actually interviewed Josh Shapiro for this YouTube channel. Feel free to check it out, and also a playlist that you can go ahead and watch. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.